America's working class has been cheated. That is an assertion.
Open border coordinate. That's a Koch brothers proposal.
And the Democrats jumped right on board with the corporatists. They got in bed with Wall Street, military-industrial complex, the fossil fuels, Silicon Valley. And now look what happened to the country. We have the biggest income disparity since the Gilded Age. Bigger than that. There's more.
Expanded trade has thrown the working class into much more competition than they experienced before trade with lower wage countries took off.
Can say is that as a country, we have to make a different set of choices because the choices we've made have hurt working people.
Congressman, because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. God damn it. My life has value.
Hello, and welcome to another Institute for Sound Public Policy podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Lynn, and today I am joined by Peter Ryan, and we're going to talk about industrial policy, and in particular, industrial policy in Ireland. So if you're wondering why Ireland, we're going to find out what happened to that Celtic tiger. But more importantly, we're also going to talk about the implications of that for other countries, like here in the United States. So let me introduce Peter Ryan. Peter, great to have you here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Appreciate learning more about what you and the Institute are up to and how our works intersect, and we both have the same mind when it comes to the primacy of industrial policy.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to introduce you. I'm going to read your bio, Peter, to introduce you to our audience. So here we go. Peter Ryan is the CEO and founder of Ryan Research. He recently completed an MA in Global History, economics was your specialty, from the University College Dublin, and was awarded first-class honors. He led research efforts at CoinDesk, the most popular cryptocurrency brand in the world, where he produced data insights, cutting-edge reports, and useful tools to help users better understand this complex industry. Prior to that, he was an analyst assisting venture capitalists and startups in marketing smarter decisions through data. He received his BA from New York University in economics with a double minor in business and web development, as well as a certificate for business and financial modeling from the Wharton School at University of Pennsylvania. Peter, welcome to the show. Again, thanks so much. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I appreciate reading out the bio there. People get a sense of, where I come from like, kind of tech startup world. And then I've more matured into understanding that you need hardware as well as the software.
Right. And that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into industrial policy in Ireland. For me, much like you, there's probably a soft spot for Ireland. My mother was born and raised in County Kerry. She grew up on a small dairy farm. She emigrated to the United States in 1952. I had gone to Ireland as a kid. Went back a few times as an adult, and was really impressed by the changes that I saw from the early 1970s, late 1960s, and into the late 1980s and early 1990s. And, before we dive into Ireland in particular, you published a wonderful article, and I will include a link to it in the notes below, and it's titled "The Rise and Fall of the Celtic Tiger." And in it, you have a quote from economist Eric Reinert, and he states, "The key mechanism to wealth is not manufacturing per se, but activities subject to increasing returns, technological change, and consequent dynamic imperfect competition under high barriers to entry. Generally, increasing returns goes with imperfect competition. Indeed, the falling unit cost is one cause of the market Excuse me, I've got someone trying to reach me on Signal there. Here we go. Go back to that. Right. Diminishing returns, the inability to extend production beyond a certain point at falling cost, combined with the difficulty of product differentiation. For instance, wheat is wheat, while car brands are very different, are key elements in creating perfect competition in the production of raw material commodities. The exports of the rich contain the good effects, which are increasing returns and imperfect competition, whereas traditional exports of poor countries contain the opposite, the bad effects. So kind of laying the groundwork there. Peter, why should people be interested in industrial policy and as it relates to Ireland?
Yeah, so I would say for the first part, you should be interested in industrial policy because it is part of the full stack of economic sectors that you need in your economy. From the big three, agriculture, industry, services, and then looking at it from a little bit more diversified angle of what exactly is being manufactured, where it is being manufactured, what are the inputs, where is it being sent, how is it being circulated through the economy or the global economy. So it is an indispensable part of a healthy economy that has unfortunately, in the era of deindustrialization in the West, has undergone a forgetting of why that's so important. And we think we can get by with just services, just finance and tech and maybe some lawyers. But what we're being kind of revealed, through error as we keep going down this road is that, no, you actually need an industry in your own country, because the way that the world works is there can be rivalries, there can be problems, supply chains can shut down. And as we learned during the lockdowns, for instance, just basic pharmaceutical things, not even getting into the specific medicines, but like face masks or penicillin or antibiotics, these things were all made in China. And suddenly there was like a gap in our ability to react and have needed supplies because we didn't have that particular industry in the United States. And that kind of just keeps extending. And in sort of policymaker discussions now, the bipartisan agreement has seemed to found consensus on, well, we need semiconductors and we need to kind of reinvigorate a protectionist policy on bringing semiconductors into the United States, because a digital economy needs, digital circuits. And so people are kind of waking up to it. Unfortunately, we thought we could live in a globalized economy where, we didn't need to have that, or that was looked down upon. So it's just getting back to the basics of understanding that a healthy nation is run with a full stack of economic sectors on top of one another. And then why Ireland is part two to your question is very interesting, is that it does represent an interesting case study of a country that has a history of undevelopment, kind of quickly going into a development cycle, unfortunately kind of veering outside of it and having some certain effects that are countervailing. But even going further back, not just the Celtic Tiger of the 1990s into the 2000s, but the history of Ireland has a lot to teach us about how does economics work. The root of economics was Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, which he was writing in Britain. And he's writing from the perspective, as a mainlander in Britain, as someone that is sort of experiencing the empire from the center out. Whereas at the same time, and previously before that, Ireland represents the first colony. And while these economic arguments are being made over here, the reality of what those economic policies are doing are taking shape in Ireland. And a lot of writers in Ireland actually give opposition to those first primordial theories of how economies work and what the best policies are. And this actually then gets featured in the American struggle for revolution, and as America develops, ultimately taking its big push in the American system of Henry Clay, in shaping the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln's economic policy. And so there is this through line where Ireland represents a very clear back and forth between the imperial economics of England and how they were creating policies that were sort of harming their colonies and rivals.
Right. Would that be correct to call it a mercantilist system?
I would say that it's always funny with all these labels. I would say that mercantilist or neo-mercantilist is probably best to have sort of an overlap with protectionist or the nationalist school of economics, the historical school of economics. I would say that England, in its development of free trade liberal economics, it had a better moniker is sort of imperial economics. And in a lot of ways, when you go back to the 18th and 17th century, there was more self-awareness that, the reason that they're creating their empire in the way that they are is so that they can do all the manufacturing in England, and then they sell those finished goods out to the colonies, and the colonies just keep sending back raw exports. And so that system has evolved into what we know as the free trade, liberal, globalizing theories that is so dominant in the West, especially in America. And we have a very sort of vacuum sealed relationship to that. Whereas when I go back to Ireland, I'm seeing how the history of those ideas really started and how there was all this opposition and real life evidence that was going back and forth. So that's why, long and short of it, Ireland is very important to understand for economics.
Right, because you look at my experience with my personal experience with Ireland really begins with my mother, and she was just part of the continuing diaspora. There were no jobs in Ireland for the young people, so the young people left. They came here to the United States. They went to the United Kingdom. They went to, as an uncle did, to Argentina and other places because there were no jobs. But then, amazingly, Patrick or Peter, something changed in Ireland. All of a sudden, I recall in the 1980s seeing these ads where it was like, come to Ireland. It's where the young people are. Like, bring your businesses here. So what happened, Peter?
Yeah. So I think to give a quick recap as quickly as I can of the revolution to then. So Ireland was a subsidiary of the United Kingdom. In 1916, it started a revolution for independence. There was war. By 1922, the Free State of Ireland was formed. Of the south of Ireland, Northern Ireland was kept out. And so from really that point onward, you have an independent policy going on in Ireland. And the first attempts were really just keeping the status quo, because immediately after the war, a civil war breaks out. And then
the Irish Free State, there was a civil war which led to the Republic.
Yeah. And by the way, there was a lot of stuff happening in Europe that was sort of forgotten by historians. Don't realize, like, there was economic crisis going on in Poland. The idea of tampering with like your money, your economic system, like, you can kind of give the initial leaders of Ireland a break in that they were dealing with a civil war. They just fought a war, and everywhere else they're seeing economic fallout. So they just tried their best to hold the ship as steady as possible. So a lot of the ideals of the revolution, what they wanted to do with the economy, didn't actually reverberate in the 1920s. The 1930s comes along, and one of the few surviving leaders of the revolution, Eamon de Valera, comes to power and takes over the government. And really what we see with him is a superficial application of some of the policies that were in the original revolutionary doctrines. He made certain attempts, but in my view, and I think in other evidence suggests this, there wasn't enough competence in fulfilling the full blueprints of what was supposed to be done. For instance, it was nominally protectionist, but through a loophole, British companies could still be dominant shareholders of Irish companies, and dictate what they would do. They stayed pegged to the British pound. They didn't develop an independent monetary system. And so there were all these false starts that goes through the 30s and 40s. Ireland is still sort of feeling, and of course, World War II happens. The whole world, the Depression, World War II, the whole world is dealing with problems. So then by the 50s and, we're rebuilding in the world and, there's the Marshall Plan, Ireland's seeing sort of now other people are getting on. By 1958, they start to rethink some of De Valera's version of protectionism. And that's when they really actually start to play with the idea of going to America and trying to get companies from America to set up shop and maybe do some exporting. Mm-hmm. What ultimately happens from 1960 to about 1980, there is some minor industrialization, textile stuff, low end, and it's largely also fueled by debt. So
okay, because the economy was still poor at this time. I think probably a lot of people were still in agriculture, and then a lot of people were on the dole, as my cousins would call it.
Yes, so there was not that much dynamism. Again, like with De Valera being the figurehead of these economic policies, there was not a real intensity with sort of going for the most innovative or the most productive and fulfilling that. And again, like I say, competence. It's not so much to just get the labels right or just, to say things, fulfilling it out, having bureaucrats under you that can make sure the policy gets through. There's a fantastic pamphlet by Joseph Connolly written in 1954, who was a De Valera insider in government. And he just kind of remarks after sort of the conclusion of that period that really the ideals of the revolution were not fulfilled. There were all these problems. And it gives you an insight of, what happened there. So Ireland ultimately, I don't think it goes downhill necessarily. I think that there was some good things that happened with that, but ultimately it does not really grow. It's very lackluster. And then when it tries to open up in the 1960s and experiment, it creates a debt bubble for itself that pops, and then they have to deal with the fallout in the early 80s of that. And so what that fallout really does is give another window of opportunity to question the model of Ireland. That's where Charles Haughey comes in the 80s. And you mentioned Eric Reinhardt, the economist earlier, who is Norwegian, but wound up himself in an office with Charles Haughey as one of the advisors for the new economic model. And it was built on the idea of Ireland should get into information technology. That's the most innovative industry. Ireland's a pretty educated place. They're English speakers. They should tackle that and be an exporter of that. And so
because they're obviously, from what Reinhardt said, they're not looking at an ism, capitalism or protectionism. They're looking at wealth creation, and that could require an imperfect competition then, correct?
Yes, and you mentioned that the imperfect competition, that is sort of where the big returns come from. I mean, if you want to go out and compete, selling indiscriminate commodities, you have a very tough time actually growing your economy and getting buyers for your wares. If you want to actually sell something that one or two other countries are doing, then that's pretty huge. It's funny, I just said that with manufactured goods, but there's also a race right now for rare commodities with sort of some of the green tech pushes. And so I've been reading Indonesia is very big now for nickel, and that could create a new sort of pole shift and where our sort of core resources are coming from, and you know how that brings value to that economy. But again, manufacturing, it's even more pronounced because most commodities are universal in some extent. And so when you have like very hard to produce manufactured goods, that gives you a moat to protect yourself
Right.
against.
That's a barrier to entry then, essentially, correct?
Exactly. But as time goes on, you know, that barrier goes down. And that's why, you know, what fueled the initial industrial revolution wasn't semiconductors, it was textiles. So what happens to textiles in the 20th century? Well, textiles end up getting pushed out to the periphery of the more undeveloped nations. And a lot of those use that as a stepping stone to more advanced economies. But the point of the matter was that those industries really only shifted because they got so competitive and they became somewhat low growth. Now, if you're moving from a very subsistence agricultural resource extraction economy, even those low growth industries like textiles can have benefits, but that's where it's like it's that much more important to be decisive with understanding, well, okay, we're going to do industrial policy, but what are we trying to do? Because Reinhart even goes into his studies about how there's tons of countries that get that wrong, and they end up manufacturing things that are not competitive. And
I so appreciate that nuance that you brought to that, Peter, because, you know, it's either one way or the other with so many people when it comes to industrial policy. But we have to be aware of the nuances, and we have to be quick on our feet and understanding, you know, whether, you know, for me, you know, I've been involved in immigration policy for a long time, and we should be looking at not just the numbers, but who we're bringing in. You know, where is the value add to this economy? And that's something that should be evaluated at least every 5 years, maybe every other year. I mean, the same with our industrial priorities, don't you think?
Yeah, exactly. It's I found the work of Ricardo Hausman, he's over at Harvard at their growth lab, to be pretty fantastic at kind of really getting at this point of you got to get out of like big words and big categories when it comes to this type of stuff. It's like you have to understand the technology. You have to understand the, you know, where it was 10 years ago, where it is today, where is it going? And you have to be held liable for kind of a subjective choice. I was also watching, there was a video that American Compass just came out with where they were profiling sort of their introduction to a new protectionist stance featuring some senators. And I forget who said.
I was actually at that event last week. Yeah.
Oh, you were? Oh, great. Yeah, I saw maybe the back of your head in the audience.
Yes.
But yeah, someone said at one point, they use the words like, we have to, at the end of the day, you know, make some subjective choices. You know, that's what governing is about. And I am very in tune with that philosophy of, you know, it can't be this idea that, you know, it's either on one hand, the market does sort of everything right, you can never question it, or you can never have a national policy that goes along with it, or it's, you know, you let the government do everything and all this stuff. And it's like these extremes that are so simplistic, whereas like actually being knowledgeable and discerning and having expertise and having consensus like that.
You know, I look at, you know, NAFTA and GATT and WTO. And I worked for Ross Perot for a couple of years. I was a volunteer for his 92 campaign. And, you know, one of the questions he would ask is if these jobs, these manufacturing jobs don't have an economic right to exist, then why does everyone want them? And you're right. Maybe there were some that could have been shed, but at the same time, we have to understand that many jobs are part of an ecosphere, if you want, for lack of a better word, an industrial ecosphere, and they give life to other companies and other technologies and more efficient and effective ways to do things.
Yeah, and you know, at the end of the day, a lot of the motivations that are gilded in fancy rhetoric, there are multinational corporations with shareholders that are international in and of themselves, which do not have a patriotic interest in a single country. would like to earn more profit for themselves as the investors and for the management of the company by getting rid of high-paid labor in the Western developed countries and shifting it into low-wage labor in the others. Not only low wage, but with severe less regulation on safety, and that we can go down the list of how different the regulatory environment is, and workers' rights. So that's what's going on. As much as like we can dress it up with this or that. So that's what they're doing. But at the same time, the people that represent the undeveloped countries that are taking those in, at many times they are cognizant of, well, this is good. We're getting these here. We're getting our labor trained. We're getting capital. If it's factories coming in, you can't move a factory that easily or
that easily.
Look
but
at
they
Taiwan. Yeah. From America they can, but
well,
the factories in Taiwan are pretty difficult to move.
I remember when the ink was being signed on the first edition of NAFTA. Someone said, look, by the time this ink is dried, most of these jobs are going to go into Indonesia, the Philippines, and other places. I was before China really kicked in. So they do move. I mean, I call it the cult of neoliberalism, which is the unimpaired movement of people and capital and goods across international borders for the express purpose of maximizing profit. And, at that conference, I like what J.D. Vance stated. He said, there are outcomes that we would like to see. And so there are things that we should subsidize. And then there are behaviors that we would like to either restrain or extinguish. And those things we should probably tax. So the government does have some tools at its disposal. But before we go down into this rabbit hole a little further, I want to bring you back to Ireland. And I want to tell you about, just an anecdote and then kind of lay out how they got there. So in the mid-90s, a girlfriend of mine who taught supply chain management and logistics ended up having dinner, and one of the guy who headed supply chain management for Intel was out at the dinner, and she asked him, how's your Irish plant going? And he glowed. She said, it's the best in the world. The workforce is amazing, really amazingly pleased with it. How did Ireland go from a place that exported its young people, its talent, to a place where here you have Intel, one of the premier manufacturers of the world, driving driving technology with their products? How did it go from, what you're talking, failed industrial policy of the 60s to a Celtic industrial tiger?
Yeah, so that's where we get back to the turn in the 1980s. The Irish policymakers decided that information technology was the wave of the future. That is the industry they should prioritize. And so through direct efforts like creating government institutions that would seed companies, that would provide supports, provide subsidy to multinational corporations. This is also when a lot of the financial schemes for the low tax loopholes would come into being. And that would intersect with a lot of educational reforms that was sort of pushing more and more Irish people into higher education.
Can I just state something here? One thing that I had felt growing up and talking with cousins and people I knew in Ireland, they seem to really value education at all levels. The elementary education, high school, college, requirements, as I recall, for teachers are pretty strict. Mm-hmm. So do you feel that the education system itself had a lot to do with how well Ireland was able to perform later?
Yeah, I think that that's often overlooked, and I've been a victim of overlooking that in the past. But I think the education system really did, in that time period, kind of prepare people to engage in those industries in a way that often gets overshadowed. But I think when you have all these trends sort of coming together in the 80s, and again, for the relative wage level of the Irish too, that plays a part. So you have kind of a nice syncing up of all these forces, so that by the early 90s, you have this new economy take hold where the multinationals come in, specified with information technology, they're getting supports for that. And there's this direct play to say, we're going to make microchips, we're going to make electronics. This is going to happen all in Ireland. We're going to, employ a manufacturing labor class. And so all these things are happening. And one of the things that is most important about this period, which is it's always a give and take, is that while the multinationals did play a big role in helping Ireland grow and providing capital, providing skills training, a lot of the key elements of that amazing Celtic Tiger growth, a lot of GDP growth, was that indigenous firms were forming in those industries. And there were government supports to make sure those firms were growing. Because it's not all the time that multinationals in and of themselves are actually creating development. When you really start to see core development, it's when indigenous firms are actually operating autonomously from those multinationals. And so that is really the spark of the Celtic Tiger: information technology, manufacturing, and indigenous firms combining with educated workforce, relative low wages, and a very self-aware government policy of, we're going to support this specific industry in this specific type of work activity. And that created a lot of economic success, which we can talk about that later. But in the turn of the 2000s, that model, that conception was kind of abandoned.
And I want to definitely get into that, because I think, a cautionary tale like that could be useful to planners here in the United States and other places around the world. But talk about the need for indigenous industries and companies and their role in that.
Yeah, so as you can imagine, for most technology firms that are global, that are based in America, they're based in San Francisco, they're based in Silicon Valley, maybe they could be based in some other spots. But the point of the matter is, those companies are never really going to do their core, like high level activity in their satellite offices around the world. And so even if there is some manufacturing that gets developed, there is always an appendage factor. They're never gonna
that like where the value is actually added and where the profits are gleaned.
Yes. Where just think about, you have the heart of the body, then you have the appendages, and the heart is where all the blood is being pumped from. So that creates drags on the potential of your economic growth, of the diversity of your economy. You get into, as we get more mature in our neoliberal capitalism, intellectual property, non-competes, all these sort of legal appendages also come in, and you create a real ceiling. And so that's why, like, just being a receptacle of multinationals is not the best policy. Certainly FDI and those companies play a role if you are in a hole, and kind of getting you out of that. But I'll take us to circulate back to another example of Japan in the 19th century,
right.
Which I find most kind of transparently obvious, is that they were very isolationist. The Westerners came in about the 1850s and 60s and said, you're opening up, and there were some unfair negotiations with their trade treaties. And they looked across the water and saw that China was already being kind of ravaged by the English, and they did not like the loss of sovereignty and degradation that was coming along with that. So they said, well, we have to do something differently so we don't wind up like China. They undergo the Meiji Revolution. an incredible effort in reform to figure out how to modernize and develop as fast as possible. And so one of the things they did that is so strikingly different from Ireland is that when they would allow Western capital investors, companies into their country, it was always explicit that that was a temporary phenomenon. They would allow them to train up the workforce, to transfer, technology, know-how, all this stuff. And then as soon as they felt they were at a sufficient spot, the license agreement would end, that Western company needs to get out, and now they'll just make a Japanese clone company to do the thing indigenously. And so that was responsible for the amazing growth where Japan went from a medieval economy in 1850 to beating Russia in
right in the Russo-Japanese War, which led to the Treaty of Shimonoseki, and
exactly. So you just see an incredible sort of trajectory where, just from the economic might perspective that obviously translates into military power, the ability for a non-Western country to beat a Western country was such of a shock at that time. And it was because the Japanese got this formula right, because they understood you have to have indigenous economics, you need to have local firms, you need to have people that are working to diversify and advance your own economy. And in Ireland, unfortunately, while that was starting to fledglingly happen in the 90s, that directness evaporated, and you're left in this spot where I can talk more about it as you get through the 2000s and the 2010s, where the innovation and the ability to keep economic growth high is sapped, and you become a PO box for someone to launder tax money through.
And is that essentially what happened then? Was that because the industries that were there, they didn't become owned by indigenous companies? You had mentioned an example of Havoc, an Irish company that was then later purchased by Intel. So it was kind of going in reverse the way, what happened with the Meiji Revolution in Japan. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, for whatever right policies they had coming out of the 80s into the 90s, when 1998 into 2000 rolls around, and this is a critical period because this is when they convert their currency to the euro and they get into the ECB. That creates sort of a dividing line where there's other individual contributing factors that are going on, but the summary in part of what then happens is that because they have this new currency, because their ability to borrow has been made easier, what ends up happening is that European lenders end up lending to Irish banks more. And then in a game of sort of dogs chasing each other's tail, the Irish banks end up using this new loose money to go into property. And
the whole story of the Anglo-Irish Bank, for instance, is just, that's a story to tell.
Yeah. And we can always admonish the individual, home buyer that was perhaps a little too high on his horse. But, these macro factors, I think, are way more important in that, European lenders gave to Irish banks, and then Irish banks, laid out more credit for specifically property, speculative property,
right?
Not industry.
Yeah, not necessarily something inherently productive. Exactly. It was a real estate scam or real estate bubble. And what was, I believe, Michael Lewis, the fellow who wrote the book, The Big Short, he and someone else wrote a second book right after that, Boomerang, which they looked at other countries around the world and what happened to them in 2008 in the real estate collapse. And, Ireland, it was just this tragic story. Like, 20% of the population was involved in construction at one point, one way or another. And they're bringing there were a lot of Polish workers in Ireland during this period.
Yeah. It's funny, you can find this correlation between, the Irish economy or, GDP or credit outlays, home prices, and then like the Polish population of expats that are in Ireland working in construction. And so that creates this force in Ireland where there is now this speculative richness that has taken over, and focuses on industry has lessened. And I don't know exactly the full smoky room activities that occurred, but for whatever reason, the politicians had it right earlier on, and then the politicians changed their mind as you get into the 2000s. And so you just have more and more of a loose touch with industrial policy. And then the crash happens, and then Ireland has to go into austerity mode, and that hurts things. They made the odd decision to take on the debt of the Irish banks.
Bail out banks that had no depositors. I didn't understand that. I want to get into the psyche of the Irishman. Again, being my mother was born and raised in Kerry, but there seems to be this desire to keep up with what's going on in England or other places, and not necessarily doing what's in the best interest of the Irish. It's almost like there's a feeling, an insecurity complex, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, so that's where, unfortunately, as the Celtic Tiger rose, that put Ireland on the global circuit of the news cycle and magazines and newspapers, what's happening over there. And then as that popularity is taking hold, now everyone sees like construction property is where we're getting rich, and then that distracts things. And then the bubble pops, and then there's like, so you like totally forgot about what got you into the original position to grow. And then when the bubble pops, the criticism is that, the Irish got ahead of themselves. They didn't understand, or, and then there's this self-critical nature to what comes next. When meanwhile, again, like it's more of a European macro situation, and specifically Irish bank sector situation, than something that was really at the fault of the individual Irishman or indigenous Irish companies, for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And so then as you get through the 2000s into the 2010s, and while these trends were always happening, what you start to see, going back to that appendage analogy I used, is that, like Ireland's this open tech economy, and it's all about the startups, and we're like this mini Silicon Valley. Because look, we have all these multinationals in Dublin 4, and you got Facebook and Google over there. Isn't this great? And when you actually inspect them, what are they doing? Like no one really asked that question. What are these companies doing in Ireland? And so when you inspect that, what are the employees' titles? What are their job functions? What are they doing? What are the departments? What you end up seeing is that these are call centers. For lack of a better word, these are sales offices, call centers for not just, the European Union, which Ireland advertises, but, sort of North Africa and the Middle East as well. And they're conducting customer service, sales, and the most needed language reported by those employers' satellite offices in Ireland is foreign language skills. So, and so that's where the irony of the Irish education system also comes in, that here you have all these educated Irish people, yet they're having a tough time finding jobs. And even now, a lot of them are still emigrating out, especially, which I think is a travesty, the medical field. There's many Irish nurses and doctors that end up in Australia, to find employment because they can't find jobs in Ireland. And so even though you have a good university system in Ireland, what ends up happening is, well, what these people need, they need to have people in these centers to like talk to France and Lebanon and, so forth and so forth. That's what's really the activity going on. And so then you look at that from, well, how does call centers help you grow your economy? And it kind of doesn't. Like, what helps you grow your economy, if you have engineers working and then a guy gets an idea and starts a firm outside and creates like more and more economic spillover.
When I worked for one of the big 6 accounting firms, I was tasked with doing site selection for a call center. And essentially it's like, you want military because you have spouses, you want colleges where you have students you can pull part-time. And, these aren't going to really push productivity. But I love you have a graphic, and it's Irish employment by macro sector, 1998 to 2021. And what's really noticeable is you see this decrease, this line going down on industry. I imagine that's manufacturing. And then it goes down till 2008, then kind of just flattens out. But the big rise is in commerce services, where it really starts to climb up in 2002. And, it looks like a disproportionate part of the economy.
Yeah. And I'll say about Irish manufacturing, what goes into that category as well is like meat processing and packaging, dairy, as well as dairy. So, what are we all now used to in our supermarkets? Kerrygold Irish butter.
Right.
So, a lot of still what gets filed in that manufacturing line, even as it's gone down so much, is activity I would say have asterisks on it as manufacturing. Like, making butter is not, semiconductors. So it's like, you got to put that into it, that it's probably even worse than that line articulates. And then you say the service sort of commerce sectors rise. So, and this is important why you look at labor and not just GDP, diversify these sectors, is because like, where's the average Irishman or woman working? Like, what are they doing? How is this benefiting a wide distribution of people? And so it's like the manufacturing has gone down, these other services have gone up. And so the Irish, for the most part, they're working in retail, and for also, lack of a better term, kind of like tourism, adjacent sectors, especially if you're in the rural countryside, your kind of livelihood is and so that, like, that's what a lot of Irish people like do in their day to day. It's not like the tech startups actually employ like very little people, and if you're a lawyer helping out with the tax loopholes, like these are small chunks. But the other very big portion that has grown are social work, teachers, and civil servants, public administration. And so, and when you look at that, what you actually reveal is that whereas most of the West, America in particular, had a huge labor increase because a lot of female emancipation into the labor force in the 80s. And so the 80s represented this big push for women in the workforce. That only happened in like the 2000s for Ireland. So it's like it's a very different economy when you put in those gender terms, where something that happened 30 years ago just started to happen in Ireland. And so when you have half the population start to suddenly enter the workforce all at once, what ends up happening is there was not good funneling for where the labor ended up. And so a lot of females, to no fault of their own, that they did not really go into productive industry. They went into sort of these kind of neutral industries of being a social worker, or being a teacher, or something like that. And a lot of that, of where the workforce went, was there. And a lot of the men that were in industry, some of them went to construction, but then a lot of men ended up going, on the dole or, becoming homeless, becoming drug addicted. And so this is all like sociologically part of this story, that the way that the economy is formed is also through what your labor force is doing, and getting into the nitty gritty of, is there uniform distribution in the right productive industries, across class, across gender, what's going on there. And so, so Ireland ends up being this, glorified call center, ends up getting a lot of people stuck in sort of retail, tourism, public administration, social work type of neutral activities. And then, a lot of people end up becoming homeless, getting on the dole. And you have this growing kind of inequality between those people kind of having an aspirational middle class that was kind of building to kind of retreating. And you have the sort of elites of Ireland that are working in the top fields of law and finance and the management positions at these tech firms, a very small percentage of the country that are really gaining the lion's share of the model that they have today.
Interesting. A lot of corollaries to here in the United States when we look at the workforce. And can you see this? Have there been studies done of, household income in Ireland where you can see, the swings up and the swings down, but, when you look at it on the macro level?
Yeah. So I don't have that study offhand right now, but, what I can tell you is that like family formation has gone down. So like the age in which you marry. And so like the idea of, building that household wealth, and what is the biggest part of a middle-class person's wealth? Their house. And so to return to the bubble, so once the bubble pops in 2008, and then like austerity measures happen, there's like a 4-year period, 6-year period where there's a lot of just stagnancy. And then, a little bit of vibrancy comes alive in like 2014 forward. But what ends up happening is that, peculiar to every other country that kind of recovered from the 2008 global financial crisis, is that when you look at their lending to construction and their mortgage lending, it's huge rise, 2008, boom, and then eventually all the countries recovered to get to a more normative level of lending to those areas. The Irish banks never did that. And so you have incredibly this flat line that never recovers in Irish bank lending to construction, which today is most observant in that every newspaper that you read in Ireland now, they have a housing problem. They have a housing crisis.
Right. And they had places in 2008 that had gone dark. They had overbuilt, and now.
Yeah. And so it's this weird phenomenon where whoever is making that decisive call, that is the reason for a housing crisis, for a shortage, why the prices are high. Banks are not giving to the front end of the construction companies, and they're not providing sufficient, down payment accessibility, interest accessibility to people that are trying to get on the property ladder. And so this is a huge problem. And then what is suggested to be the solution by the top minds of Ireland is that, well, you have all these American investment funds that are coming in, and colloquially, they're now called, and if people view them negatively over there, vulture funds. So the vulture funds are coming over, and they're actually filling in the gaps where the bank should be and developing properties and all this type of stuff. And this is also where you maybe get like a descriptor of certain Irish apartment blocks now, where it's like very utilitarian and very tight and it's small, because these people kind of don't have local interest at the heart of what they're doing. So everyone's complaining about that. And so it's like the messaging is, well, you need to increase the amount of foreign capital that's doing all of that. That's what's going to help the housing crisis. That's from one side of the aisle. The other side of the aisle suggests you need to have the state do everything. And, again, it's sort of these like simplistic extremes, but a more elegant solution is like, wait a minute, someone look at the banks. All they need to do is open up the credit. Yeah, open up their credit facilities and start actually lending. Like one of the most basic things they do, lend to build houses. You think about like A Wonderful Life.
You look at local and regional banks here. That's what they do. They lend to companies for commercial real estate, and they lend to households to purchase homes.
Yeah, and so this becomes part of the puzzle that is then the after effects of the bubble, and how there's these misalignments in the individual Irish person's economic livelihood. They cannot get on the property ladder. If they can't do that, they have a tough time forming families. They have a tough time building up their wealth. They have a tough time actually being productive in the economy. If you're constantly in a position where you're sort of hamstrung, you're not gaining new knowledge. You're not working on problems that then lead to innovation. So these are all problems that are compounding on themselves. And as you get more and more down this line and farther away from the productive policies of the 80s and 90s, you will see bigger and bigger cracks. So that is really the state of the Irish economy today. It is kind of this like low intensity basket case of a small percentage of elites pilfering these tax loophole arrangements with other multinational corporations, while everybody else is kind of just like floating in a very precarious economic stagnation.
Wow. Now, when you look at your studies of Ireland, what lessons are to be learned from American industrial planners and policy planners?
Yeah, so I would say that indigenous firms are the best policy. America has a different relationship also because of its size, because of its dominance on the world stage, because of its consumer market. Those play a different characteristic, which gives it more leverage. Like when you see, I don't know, like a Toyota plant in Arkansas or something like that, or Kentucky. And that's not exactly all bad, but I would say that where you can, you always want indigenous industry, because you're retaining intellectual property, you're retaining patents, you're retaining the labor force. Because again, the labor force, and we talk, and in your work, I'm sure you talk a lot about how the labor force of the undeveloped world can be very mobile, but the labor force of the developed world is actually not very mobile. Like
no. In fact, years ago, I was at a luncheon where the new bishop who had recently installed in Los Angeles was speaking, and he was talking about the need for more immigrants and for us to be more welcoming. And, I raised my hand. I said, Padre, I get it, but where would you, I gave him the number at the time of the number of Americans that are unemployed, underemployed, or simply given up looking for work. And I said, where would you recommend they immigrate to find work and a better life than they can have here? And he went silent, because there isn't. It's very difficult for an American to migrate to a country and be allowed to work. We were talking about doctors, and I know someone who had gotten a medical degree in Belgium, and he had to say that he would not look for work in Belgium after he graduated from medical school there. It's very difficult. And we seem to, years ago, we did a poster campaign in San Francisco. We took over about 200 trains on the Bay Area Rapid Transit and a couple of stations. And these posters that we put up were very simple and straightforward. It basically said, U.S. tech workers, your employers think you are expensive, undeserving and expendable. Call on Congress to fix H-1B visa law. And that's exactly it. So, we saw this loss of manufacturing jobs, quote unquote, that didn't have an economic right to exist, depart, in the 90s and early 2000s. And then at the same time, they're telling these workers who are being displaced to learn to code. Well, starting in 1990, we began to displace Americans who were writing code with cheaper replacements. And we know they weren't skilled workers because the Americans had to train them on their jobs in order to get the severance pay. So this is where we are. And I'll relate a story, and then I want to let you speak for the next 10 minutes before we wrap up. But I was at a tax conference probably in about 2010. And a woman who was a director at Deloitte was talking about at the time how they had created a group in Hyderabad, India, that they would outsource the preparation of the business personal property tax return to. And, if you're like a Bank of America, for instance, you have branches all over the country, and we have literally over 1,000 taxing jurisdictions here in America, and it's hard to keep track of. Well, you outsource that to a firm. And that was business that I would compete for. But when you went and put this group in India where, people are earning a fraction of what we were earning, a living have a living wage here in the US, it was amazing. But to me, the issue was not so much the money, but when you graduate from college and you have a degree in accounting, you go into tax, the first thing you're given is the return to do, because that's where you learn taxability of everything. If it's a pipeline running above or below ground in a county in Houston, in Texas, is it taxable or isn't it? You're going to learn all of that. And then after 10 years of that, you're going to get into provisioning, and then later in life, tax planning. However, if you pull out these bottom rungs, where does that leave your workforce? I mean, you have a degree, but you can't use it, and you can't develop the skills. And unless it's a slugfest out there then to hold a job in something you might have gone to college for.
Yeah, and so right there, you end up in a position where, from sort of the macro view, you are losing skills, you're losing productivity that otherwise would be there of your workforce. From the workforce's perspective, it's, they can't be mobile, and so they become dislodged and they become put upon by all these burdens, and that creates social problems. That creates real angst, but that can take form in torn apart families and drug addiction and all these sorts of ways, and political instability. So these are all major problems that get glossed over. And so then returning back to Ireland, again, like the ability to have an indigenous firm and make those a priority, you have more autonomy of keeping that industry in your country, of keeping the specific activities, the skills in your country, and making sure your workforce is aligned with that and isn't going to be tossed aside. Whereas again, if a foreign company does not have like a national interest to a country they're not a citizen of. So that it seems almost like an obvious point, but we have to hammer it home today, because some people can't kind of understand that. And a lot of citizens of other countries, and I've had the fortune experience to kind of intermingle with some of them. They don't have a problem with computing rivalry among different nations of the world. It's very nonchalant and understood by them, whereas in the West it's difficult. Maybe not so much for some of the Europeans, but so indigenous firms, and then the distinction between speculative and productive economic activity. So property bubble, speculative. Construction can be good. Construction right now in Ireland is needed because there is a shortage, but just pouring tons of money into speculative activities that do not really have productive spillovers That is not how you grow an economy. Understanding what is productive, getting back to the original quote from Reinhardt that you used at the intro, increasing returns to scale. Is every expenditure of cost that you're putting in actually creating more output?
Mm-hmm.
So that is what you really need to be looking for. And that often comes from manufacturing as a backbone of making sure your economy is that way. So, for a lot of the 20th century, that was automobile manufacturing. That's why many countries from Germany to Japan, and some other country that did not have such of a great shot at that, India being one, they all kind of like look towards automobile manufacturing as a really good industry for growth, because it did have a lot of potential. It was a lot of parts. It was a lot of different ways of combining it. One of the great things about, let's say, like having a Toyota plant was that engineers that worked at that plant would actually then learn something, come out and create a mechanic shop where maybe they sold one part to the Toyota plant. And that kept creating this entanglement, this ecosystem. And then from that ecosystem, services go on top of that. So now you need tax guys for all those little mechanic shops. And so and so even though like manufacturing is now worse, kind of getting at this prominence of it, it's not to say like services or even agriculture or exporting raw extraction commodities is like bad in some way. It's just like, you wouldn't say the tires are more important than your steering wheel in a car. Kind of, it's like you need all of these
You need it
pieces.
all, right?
Yeah. So
You reminded me of another Perrotism, and that was the brains always follows the manufacturing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if you don't have manufacturing, a lot of the activity that then gets filtered into services is coming from the manufacturing and the need to understand it. I mean, like, how many data analytics guys are there that are only employed because of they have to do data analytics on like supply chains of manufactured goods and logistics?
Right.
And then now those data analytics guys, they need software programs, and now they're getting sold software as a service programs from Silicon Valley companies. So, I mean, like this is how the economy really works. It's this like frothing up type of structure. And so like there's no combativeness to these different regions of the economy, but it's more about saying they need to all work together. They have to all work in harmony. And to give you another Irishism, I spoke, Celtic Tiger and recent history, but getting back to my point about why Ireland's so important from like a historical perspective about economics and going all the way back. One of the premier American economists that really helped formulate the American system of America, tariff policy, all this stuff, was Henry C. Carey. He was a Irish American. His father, Matthew, was from Dublin, and kind of acculturated him in a lot of these ideas that were ultimately derived from his experience in Ireland. And one of his main phrases was the harmony of interests. That was what he wanted to get across in how he was talking about manufacturing, industry, national self-sufficiency. He kept trying to hit home this idea of this is not about exactly GDP growth, even though that can be a side effect. We're trying to make all the interest in our country, from the richest to the poorest, to the artisan, to the laborer, to the banker, the interest all need to conform to a harmony for the nation to prosper. And I think that is sort of the inspiration out of looking at Ireland, understanding its economic history, and how that economic history has fundamentally shaped how the American system was created, and how those derivatives that we take now to be American industrial policy, national self-sufficiency, do have a complete through line back to Ireland through Henry C. Carey.
Interesting. Wow. Well, Peter, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate this talk we've had. I think our audience is going to love it. Now, if they want to learn more about you, Peter, do you have a website, a newsletter that they can get on?
Yes, I would recommend that everyone follow me on Twitter @_Peter Ryan. You can also find my Substack, ryanresearch.substack.com, which is the best place to find my writing, to subscribe, to get me in your inbox. One of the main article series that I will be doing is sort of a live research project that I'm putting together for my future book, which will be on Henry C. Carey and also his father. And yeah, really trying to elaborate and explain who these men were, what their ideas were, how they fit into the American history, how Ireland connects to that, and how their ideas actually really expanded across the globe and inform much of what we understand to be as, you know, sort of like a very pragmatic industrial policy, but, you know, comes back to, you know, you can trace all the lines back to them. So that is my future project. That will be a lot of what my writing will be upon. If you're interested in that, you know, please check it out. But yeah, this has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, to my audience, thank you so much. You've hung in here till the bitter end. Be sure to smash that like button, give us a thumbs up, and subscribe. That way, when we have more great conversations like this, you'll be in the loop on them. And again, Peter, thank you. To my audience, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your support, and have a great day.